automotive trade could be heading towards a major overhaul. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement is approaching a review in July. The Trilateral Free Trade Pact governs North American auto trade. The USMCA is a crucial piece of a complicated global trade puzzle. For the past few weeks, the Automotive News team has broken down the real-world impact of new trade rules and the USMCA review on automakers, suppliers, and dealers. The USMCA spells out certain requirements for duty-free trade among the US, Canada, and Mexico. We break down what the trilateral agreement requires and how President Donald Trump's tariffs have impacted trade in North America. Automakers are shifting production of key models, like the Chevrolet Equinox and Jeep Cherokee, to avoid high import tariffs from China and Mexico. The future of the North American automotive industry hinges on this agreement. So what does this mean for suppliers, for automakers, for everyone in the automotive industry? What could actually happen during this year's review? And what does this trade agreement mean for the future of global trade? We've got those answers and more in our State of Automotive Trade package. We also have helpful visuals and tools, like our interactive map that shows how automakers are shifting production to avoid high import tariffs from China and Mexico, or our list of US production by model, comparing 2025 volume to the 2028 forecast. We also have a graphic on the basics of how the USMCA works, and a new tariff calculator available for all access subscribers. It shows how auto tariff rates change based on country of origin and the imported vehicle or part. You can check out all of this and more at autonews.com. But we'll give you a glimpse into our coverage right now. The USMCA's formal review process starts July 1st. But negotiations and groundwork for the review are already happening. Molly Boygan, a reporter covering technology and innovation for Automotive News, recently sat down with Lindley Brown, a global trade partner at Ernst & Young. They talked about everything we know about the negotiation process so far, which countries are talking, what topics are on the table, and what the timeline of the review is. Here's a part of their conversation.
My understanding of why the stakeholders are so interested in revisiting the rules of origin provisions is because they claim that some countries are basically circumventing the duties that they would have to pay by importing maybe raw materials into Mexico, processing them in Mexico, and then getting the benefit of the USMCA.
Yeah.
How big of a problem is that to your understanding?
I think it's kind of interesting to think about, because you have non-preferential rules of origin, so like all the stuff that's not USMCA, and then you have preferential rules of origin. And within USMCA, we've got either regional value content, which is like, is it 60% regional content, or you have a tariff shift, which is I imported this thing and it was in this kind of form, and when I exported the finished good, it was a totally different thing, versus this substantial transformation concept for non-preferential origin. So when I kind of hear the argument that says, okay, so we're importing a raw material into Mexico and we're manufacturing it, and that article, that thing I imported, is losing its identity and it's becoming part of this other thing. That's the first step. That's not an easy hurdle, because substantial transformation is like, it's pretty squishy. There's a lot of precedent in the US, but still, like, definitionally wise, like new name, character, or use isn't like a real bright line test. Then you have the rules of origin come into play. And as we know, right, the automotive rules of origin they're gnarly, right? Is it 70% this, plus we have a labor content, and it depends sort of if you're doing the value based on the cost of production, the net cost, or if you're doing it based on the sales price, that transaction value. I do think that there's very likely really good activity happening in Mexico that currently substantiates either the substantial transformation test and or the rules of origin. I think where the administration is focused is around, do we think it's enough, right? So in certain areas, and I think the thing that is really interesting when I was sort of, preparing for this is we have the steel and the aluminum and the metals derivative, the 232. Well, they totally changed the paradigm, right? When they, a couple weeks ago, and said, okay, cool. Even if it's USMCA, we don't care. You're still paying, that 25%, which is kind of wild, right? Because originally in the first iteration of it, it was like, okay, if it's USMCA qualifying, you don't have to pay the 232s. And now they're saying, nah, even if it qualifies, you're still paying it. So I think maybe that's one step for how the administration is really looking to combat it, because the issue is you have to have a rule set for determining the origin of a thing. And it's pretty stringent as it is. And so I don't know how they would make it harder, except for what the metals situation did, which basically said we don't actually care unless it's 95% US origin, like, or the UK piece, like you're kind of out of luck. I think that's what they're going to have to do. I think they're going to have to focus on commodities that are very important and do something similar and say, this is kind of outside of the realm of USMCA. We're going to penalize the use of anything other than U.S. steel. I think that's how they're going to have to do it, because otherwise the rules of origin they're actually pretty complete, and they actually take a lot of effort to, because it's like always a two-step test. Like, one, did that thing that came in from a third country, was it substantially transformed in Mexico? And then the second test is, did that whole finished good meet the rule of origin under the USMCA? So a lot of companies fall, if they take the time to do the analysis, which maybe is the bigger question, they don't meet the rules many, many times anyway. I think the risk comes in where no one really enforces it. Companies are like, cool, we're importing to Mexico. We're doing some stuff in Mexico. It's clearly Mexican and it's USMCA. And then they just claim it on the way in. And then it becomes part of that DOJ task force, which is like, okay, are you transshipping? Which I think was like in the very early days of the presidency. Like, so I think they do have their radar on the right elements. I think I would sort of respectfully posit that maybe it's not an issue with like the USMCA rules of origin, but the overall paradigm for how enforcement is happening on both the Mexico side and the US side. And perhaps that recent 301 investigation on forced labor that lists like 60 economies, I think that might be trying to get, and Mexico's named, right? I think that might be trying to get to that piece, which in my opinion is probably like, there's a lot more efficacy in that approach than like retooling the whole rules of origin bit.
Canada hopes that the USMCA review will help get its trade with the US back to normal. The goal for the Canadian auto industry in the negotiations is removing the Section 232 tariffs currently imposed on vehicles crossing the border. David Kennedy, Toronto bureau chief for Automotive News Canada, recently sat down with Lana Payne, national president of Unifor, to talk about what Canada wants to get out of these negotiations. Here's a look at their conversation.
And, as we've already seen over the past few weeks, the temperature in the room's going up a little bit. We're seeing some more rhetoric fly. Beyond that, in your conversations with both officials in Canada and the US, are you seeing appetite for a deal?
What I see is the conditions right now of what these tariffs have done to the United States and to Canada. The US manufacturing sector has been hurt dramatically by the tariffs that they've put on Canadian goods or inputs, whether it's aluminum or steel or whatever the case may be. Obviously, the closer you get to a deadline, the more important it is to focus in. I mean, this is true of union negotiations the same way as it is of negotiating trade agreements. I believe when you listen right now, you're going to get, because it's almost like the pre-negotiating stage, there will be a lot of posturing. That is to be expected. And what I would say to Canadians is, don't be too fussed by that. We have a job to do at the bargaining table, and hopefully we're successful there. I do believe, the U.S. needs an agreement with us. We are their number one customer. And we have created leverage for ourselves as well, outside of the leverage that we naturally would have. You hear it often from Jameson Greer. They are not happy with the fact that American Chardonnay booze have been removed from many of the shelves in Canada. That gives us a leverage point in negotiations. And we have others. We have lots of strength here based on the fact, that energy if you look at the energy markets and the fact that Canadian energy is needed in the United States. If you look at aluminum, despite the fact that there's a tariff on it, my gosh, does the U.S. need our aluminum right now? Despite what the president will say, the whole situation in Iran has created, I would say, even more conditions that are favorable to Canada to be able to get to a place where we're getting a trade deal. The other thing I would say, though, is that it's very unlikely that this is going to be sorted by July 1st. And so it's really important for us to put this in perspective. I had no expectations that this would be done by July 1st. So I don't want people to feel disappointed that that's the case. We just carry on and we put our heads down. We negotiate as much as we can. And then in the reality, if we get to a place where a deal isn't possible, we'll have to deal with that outcome at that time.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Canada being the US's best customers. Certainly when it comes to auto, there's no argument. There's no other market for, D3 pickup trucks, for instance. Canada's the one that buys those really almost exclusively.
Yes.
So are you seeing much, are you seeing the companies who you represent or members working at the companies who you represent step up a little bit more and make that argument in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, many of them have been doing some of this, what I would say, behind the scenes. In other words, not in op-eds and all of that, but certainly you have seen Jim Farley speak very clearly, the CEO of Ford Motor Company, about needing a CUSMA USMCA. Depending on what country you're in, we use different acronyms. That this is important to Ford Motor Company. It's important to the auto industry, and that we should focus on where our bigger problems are. For example, China. So I'm in agreement on a lot of those things. I would say is we have to work together here. He's been very clear from the beginning that we needed an ability to get an agreement around autos, and that CUSMA, if we had to tinker around edges to do things, we had a whole priority list before we got into this trade war around how we saw CUSMA could be improved. For example, the rapid response mechanism, which I'm sure you're aware of, which basically lays out an ability to protect things like freedom of association and unionization, which was available to Mexican workers. Our position is that this should be available in all of North America. There may come a time, for example, and this is where I would be propositional, where workers in the southern United States or other U.S. states where there are right to work laws, that they may also feel that their rights are being infringed, their freedom of association is being infringed, and therefore should be able to have access to the rapid response mechanism. So that was one of our priorities. Obviously, talking about rules of origin so that you could increase and onshore more of the work in North America was very important. But all of that, is in column B, I would say to you right now. The main priority is getting the tariffs removed, having the side letter respect it, and then looking at what else can we do together to improve the auto industry for North America.
Tariffs are at the top of Mexico's priorities coming into the USMCA review. Like Canada, it currently faces a 25% tariff on auto exports. But vehicles that comply with the USMCA requirements only face these tariffs on their non-US content. Tariffs aren't the only thing. The U.S. has raised critical issues with drug trafficking and China's expanded auto investment into Mexico. The list of U.S. demands reflects how Trump is using trade agreements to advance a broader agenda. The USMCA may no longer be a trade agreement, but a tariff agreement. Tony Payan, director of the Center for U.S. and Mexico at Rice University, recently told Automotive News. But Mexico will likely have to contend with tariffs on auto imports even after the review, experts say. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said USMCA talks would not remove tariffs on autos and steel. And Mexican Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard said the trade pact would likely have to coexist with U.S. tariffs. Instead, Mexico is looking to reduce them, he said. There's also the issue of China's auto presence in Mexico. Vehicles from about 30 Chinese auto brands have gone on sale in Mexico since the pandemic, and Chinese auto brands currently hold about 15% of the market, according to the Mexican Auto Dealers Association. Some U.S. policymakers are nervous that Mexico could become a springboard for Chinese-made vehicles and parts to enter the U.S. The review could result in some additions to the USMCA regarding this topic, said David Gantz, a trade fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute. And while Guillermo Rosales, head of the Mexican Association of Automobile Distributors, said he's not aware of a formal proposal regarding China since the talks are still in early stages, he said there is pressure from the Trump administration, lawmakers, and unions for restrictions on Chinese investment in the auto sector. But Juan Carlos Baker, Mexico's former deputy trade minister who helped negotiate the USMCA, said concerns about Chinese auto investment are overblown because, quote, there is not a single Chinese OEM manufacturer in Mexico, end quote. Today, we've looked into the USMCA and the auto industry as a whole, as well as the priorities of each of the countries involved. But this trade agreement and its players mark just a small portion of global automotive trade. At Automotive News, we dig deeper into the global implications of the review, possible outcomes for each of the countries involved, and broader topics, including what tariffs mean for suppliers, dealers, and vehicle repair. For more coverage on the state of automotive trade, look to autonews.com.